Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. As we approach this end of 2022, it's time for many of us to look back on the year that was and reflect on the top 10 moments in Illinois and Missouri politics. To do that, joining me is our political analyst, Anita Manion. For The Record, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
It's always good to see you, and I know we're going to look back. One of the things that happened in 2022 was we launched this new digital program.
That's right. That must be number one.
Number one in the minds of our viewers, we hope, our loyal viewers. And thank you to those of you who spent part of your 2022 with us. We're going to look at the top 10 moments, starting at number 10 and ending at number 1. These are in some particular order, but of course the rankings themselves are subjective. And we took a little bit of a look at the different political headlines to happen in the last year. Number 10, coming in at number 10, Missouri voting to legalize marijuana. The state voting overwhelmingly for adults to buy and sell recreational marijuana in Missouri, hopping on the bandwagon that many other states had already jumped on.
That's true, although Arkansas's initiative failed at the same time. So this was interesting to me because the way the bill was written and the controversy around that. The controversy was less about legalizing recreational marijuana and more about how to do it. So you saw Mike Parson and Tashara Jones on the same side of this issue.
And part of the concern, I think, was that it's now baked into, pardon the pun, baked into the Constitution in the state. And that's been something to watch for. It seems that it's a very low bar in Missouri to change the Constitution. And that was one of the concerns, that by putting it in there, it's harder for legislators to come back and clean up or change or alter the regulations in the future.
That's right. That was one of the criticisms, although one of the strategies for ballot initiatives has been to put them in the Constitution because sometimes the state legislature does want to tinker with them. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. Double-edged
sword there for sure. As we look forward to 2023, are there things that you think, the implementation, the market side, we're not going to see a lot of the actual buying and selling of marijuana until early February or so, as these pot shops that have medical marijuana now can start to expand. Are there things that you're watching for in the political arena around maybe, for example, local cities can add that extra sales tax, I think 3% on top, where they can collect? Are there political fights that you're looking forward to in the upcoming new year?
I think that first stage, because as you said, it's the existing dispensaries that will get those recreational licenses first. So I expect that to run pretty smoothly. But that's one of the criticisms, is those who are already benefiting will disproportionately benefit from this new program. So I'm interested to see how those micro businesses turn out, and those are supposed to be given priority to communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. And then another interesting aspect to watch is the expungement process and how, if that works as smoothly as proponents say it will.
Certainly.
Don't hold your breath.
There's the criminal justice aspect we should not ignore. The federal government is also looking at ways to relax regulations around banking and the way that they process transactions and have cash coming into stores or actual credit cards there. Plus the medical side. There's going to be a lot of extra and expanded research, not only in Missouri, but across the country as that rolls out. Coming in at number 9 was a bit of a surprise in a big local race. Many people were watching in St. Louis County to see House Republican Shamed Dogan. Could he muster enough support to beat Sam Page? But he stumbled in the primary race, a race he thought he might win easily. He and his supporters felt supremely confident, but then came the little-known Catherine Pinner, a local activist who sort of had her claim to fame through the coronavirus, protesting masking rules, and peddled quite a few, we'll just call them what they were, conspiracy theories on her website. This caught a lot of people by surprise, perhaps not the least of which Shamed Dogan himself.
I think that's right. It certainly caught me off guard. This was my biggest surprise on primary night as you're watching, and I think most of us were already looking forward to that general race where you'd have Shamed Dogan and Sam Page, which I think would have been a very close race. And all of a sudden it was like, who is Catherine Pinner? And so the Google search uncovered some of those conspiracy theories. But I think this was a real upset. And I think, then you had, as a consequence, Mark Maxwell stepping in at the 11th hour and made that county executive race much more dynamic than we expected it to be.
And people wonder, why would this make a top 10? It's a county executive race. Well, it's the largest county in the entire state of Missouri, the largest local government in the entire state of Missouri, and it could have been a shift, the first time in decades that a Republican would have controlled that office.
That's right. And I think just the fact that this was such an upset in the primary probably has both parties thinking about, basically Shemad wasn't campaigning because they thought he was a shoo-in. So how should they approach primaries differently? So that might be something to look for in the future.
We'll have other traces of this sort of broad discussion as we continue through our top 10 list here. I guess I shout out to David Letterman. Did he make the top 10 list famous, or did that exist before him?
I think that's right.
But Shemad Dogan was sort of this moderate Republican, somebody who, I don't know if you would have put him in the never Trump lane, but certainly somebody who in his closing speech from the floor of the Missouri House criticized and gave warnings, cautionary tales of where the party could be headed if they were leaning into the cultish personality style of a party. And he kind of called for that pull back to the middle. Other Republicans like him did well in congressional races or Senate races across the country. So was it more or less in that he just took the victory for granted and less a rebuke of his style of politics?
I think absolutely so. And he is a prolific fundraiser too. So he had this big war chest, but he didn't really use any of it in the primary.
He was keeping his powder dry.
That's right.
Until the general that he never got to fight.
Yes. I think the biggest person breathing a sigh of relief on that August night was probably Sam Page. But then we'll talk about what happened after that.
Yeah, I think we're going to, she might have seen our top 10 list. We're not just catching her off guard. Maybe more on that St. Louis County race to come in our top 10. But let's move on from number 9 now to number 8. And we're going to steer our gaze to Capitol Hill, where Congress passed the first significant piece of gun safety legislation in decades. And Missouri's own Senator Roy Blunt played a key hand in that, not only securing many millions of dollars in mental health funding, but also propping up new federal tranches of money that could support and bolster, build out state enforcement of red flag laws. We do have those in Illinois. We don't have those in Missouri. Were you at all surprised to see Roy Blunt put a little bit, he had a lot of Republicans in Missouri saying don't do this, right, putting pressure on him, not only on this, but on the recent gay marriage vote. Were you surprised to see him on his way out of the Senate sort of cross the party aisle here?
He has sort of prided himself in his ability to work across the aisle, but I did wonder, would he have supported these bills if he were seeking re-election in Missouri? Would he have been as likely to support them? But he, I think, has tried to show himself, particularly the last couple of years, overseeing Joe Biden's inauguration and other things, as a more moderate Republican, and I think he wants to go out with that sort of reputation. So I think this helps solidify it. And in Missouri, we recently had the school shooting at Central Visual and Performing Arts. So I think that this is an issue that's resonating with Missourians a lot more personally now.
There are those moments, those tragedies that interrupt our daily lives, that the horror and the tragedy that we see flash across our screens, not just here in St. Louis. There was also in the mass shooting on July 4th, Independence Day in Highland Park, of course, Uvalde, Texas, that horrific scene there. It seems that those moments really galvanize the focus of the people who have debated these issues for many years, decades even in this case,
right,
but couldn't find the moment or the political will to take action on it until everyone's focus was unfortunately brought back to the issue again.
That's right, and this bill was passed right in the wake of the Uvalde shooting and the Buffalo shooting. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it seems like there's a new shooting every week to discuss. And so while this bill didn't go as far as a lot of gun control activists would have liked, as you said, it was historic, and it's the first congressional action that's been taken in about 30 years.
Some of the things it did not include were a ban on assault weapons. There used to be one back in the 1990s into the early 2000s. That was not included. There was also not a raising of the legal age to buy a long gun federally. Those were some of the things left off the table, things that we might look forward to in 2023. In fact, very early in the new year, Illinois could do just that and be one of the first states in the. So there are several other countries that have done some of that, but banning assault weapons, high capacity magazines, and raising the legal age to buy a gun, that seems like it's one of those debates in Illinois that would inflame the regional tensions. Downstate has a different feeling around gun culture than maybe Chicago does.
I think that's right, and if those laws are implemented, we can expect to see a onslaught of legal challenges, as we've seen when New York has enacted stricter gun laws as well.
In fact, there's a gun lobbyist who just recently testifying before a committee in the Illinois legislature said, if you pass this bill, we'll see you in court.
100%.
Throwing down the gauntlet.
Yeah.
And certainly that's something that could land even before the U.S. Supreme Court. All right, that was number 8, happening at the congressional level with ripple effects perhaps in Missouri and in Illinois, depending on the future of those votes at the state house levels, and we'll continue to track those as well. But moving on now to number 7, something happening in Jefferson City, Missouri, slashing the income tax rate. Governor Mike Parson's decision blocked immediate relief that might have come in the form of cash payments. He vetoed that, striking it down, trading it out instead for what really amounts to a flat income tax. There are some adjustments at the lower end, like your first $1,000 is now no longer taxed as opposed to your first $500 you make. But by and large, this is really just a flat income tax in a state that technically does have those progressive or graduated income tax levers. They didn't play with those.
No, they didn't. And, analysis has found that this will benefit upper income earners much more so than middle and lower income earners in the state. And also those who are on fixed incomes like Social Security won't benefit from this tax cut. Having said that, Missouri had a budget surplus this year. It's a priority for particularly the Republicans in the governor's office and the state legislature to say, let's give Missourians back that tax money, let's slash taxes. And folks aren't ever mad about getting their taxes cut. I think the challenge here, though, is we already have underfunded schools. I don't know if you drive on these roads, but you're avoiding potholes. There's a lot of infrastructure things that we could use investments in Missouri. And what tax cuts are cuts to revenue. And we can expect to see their estimates are about $764 million in lost revenue in the state.
It weakens the state as an apparatus of government. Not the state as a whole or an economy. That's a nature of debate, right? Like some people might say, more money back in your pocket is strengthening the state as a whole and its collective people. But the state government agencies, as you're suggesting, they just have less money to go around. Education, less money to go around when it takes in less. But there's also this other debate of if you're going to cut taxes, which taxes do you cut? And sometimes raising the issue that, hey, this is a graduated income tax structure. They could have done a progressive income tax cut to lower taxes for the middle class. You'll even have that's an objective statement, right? They could do that.
Right.
Some critics in the audience will even say, well, that sounds like you're pushing a progressive agenda. No, Josh Hawley himself, after the midterm election results, said that the Republican Party needs to be more responsive and sensitive to the middle class and the working class.
Yeah.
This is an avenue that Republicans could do that.
And that was a criticism of the Trump tax cuts as well, that they disproportionately benefit the wealthy instead of lower income Americans. There were some state representatives who were quoted as saying, we've done plenty for low income Missourians and Americans, and it's not the time to focus on them. There were others who said, we do think it's important and we'll bring it up in the next session. So I think that's something to watch for.
Do you draw a distinction between Republicans who appeal to working class and middle class voters on social issues alone and they don't give them the economic relief that you might expect? Or could that be an evolution of the party as they look into the new year?
Yeah, I think we have seen in the Trump era and with Josh Hawley a more populist economic message coming out of the Republican Party. And as they're increasing their base among, white voters without a college education, that is going to be important for them to pay attention to.
We saw Josh Hawley's recent debate. If you're watching Congress in this last, we're getting off track from our top 10 here for a little bit, but just some commentary on that front. Josh Hawley's office was hoping that they could include some antitrust provisions, didn't make it into the final version. So they're kind of going at big business and attacking what they call monopolies there and not getting a whole lot of support on that just yet. But it's interesting to watch that evolve. But let's move on to number 6, moving on from number 7 now, getting back to local politics here. Before we can start with all of this, we're going to take this in chunks here. St. Louis County Executive Sam Page, the Democrat, reelected to a full 4-year term, but not without accumulating some political baggage of his own. Page's office mired in scandal much of 2022. A top political aide, Tony Weaver, busted in an FBI undercover sting operation. Page claims that safeguards in his office prevented the fraudulent use of any COVID money that was involved in this scheme to take bribes and kickbacks in exchange for handing out American Rescue Plan Act dollars. Also after that, after Tony Weaver's indictment, the chief of staff there fired for indiscretions inside the office. All of this seemed to be baggage that might hurt Sam Page in a primary. He survived against Jane Duker. Might hurt him in a general election matchup against not Shamed Dogan, not Catherine Pinner, but Mark Manavani. He survived all of it.
He did. But had he had a more consistent opponent, had, for example, Shamed Dogan won the primary and been there consistently, hammering home these messages, there could have been a different outcome. But I think with Manavani coming in at the last minute, also being a former Democrat, he talked about things more from an administrative standpoint. You got to run city government almost like a business. But certainly Sam Page had a variety of scandals and in addition a lot of COVID backlash to the restrictions that St. Louis County replaced. So it did seem him a time that he could be vulnerable, but in the end he prevailed.
And this is another one of those pieces of context that affected the entire political calendar, but certainly it seemed apparent in the Sam Page re-election race that COVID concerns in 2022, this seemed to be the year that those faded from our political immediate memory, right? Like we're all still feeling the aftershocks, especially on the inflation side, but the local government officials and executives like Sam Page who made those tough decisions in 2020 and 2021 didn't really seem to, I mean, a lot of the people, the governors across the states that had those tougher COVID rules, they didn't really face much in the way of political backlash this year.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think other issues like inflation, like crime, like abortion really overshadowed COVID in the 2022 election cycle.
If you're looking at Sam Page's administration, and if you set aside the federal COVID money that came flowing in, can you name any political victories besides just winning re-election? Does he have any deliverables? He can go to the people and say, I did this.
None come to mind, and I think that's problematic. Although I think it's also fair to say he was governing at a very difficult time where just getting through the pandemic in some ways was an accomplishment, and I think that's sort of what he said himself. I think he would argue they've made some, small savings and different things, but I think it's hard to identify one big outstanding achievement.
Maybe he'll say you have to thrive before you can, or survive before you can thrive. Maybe there will be the active parts of his agenda as opposed to just the defensive parts of his government agenda in the next year to come. That rounds out our number 10 through 6. We're now going to enter that hallowed ground, the top 5.
I have a feeling we're going to talk more about corruption.
More corruption on the horizon. It has been if there's one overarching theme, coronavirus fading, corruption staying strong, maybe a few others.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing about corruption. I don't like that that's a theme this year, but I think it is.
On both sides of the river.
That's right.
It seems that corruption is a bipartisan, bi-state problem. But making our top 5, we're going to step aside from that and go back to the campaign trail as Attorney General Eric Schmitt solidifies his position as the next U.S. Senator from Missouri. Schmitt's strategy largely focused around sort of a backdoor to earned media. He didn't line up a bunch of local interviews and go in glad hand with the press and get the long-form discussions on programs like these. No. He filed lawsuit.
No bitterness there.
After look, we tried. We tried to reel in the Attorney General, and unsuccessfully so. But he did say, even on the last day before the election, talking to a crowd of voters, "You know me from the lawsuits." It seemed like that was his strategy.
It seemed like that for a year before he ran, right? That it was sort of, he was raising these lawsuits to identify issues. So even if they weren't winning lawsuits, like suing school districts or suing China, but they got his position across in a very public way. And I think that was effective. It let voters know who he was and what he stood for.
Eric Schmitt defeating Trudy Busch Valentine, the Democrat, by an easy margin in the general election. But before that, it was more of an open question. He probably came in the front runner. Most of the polls showed that and suggested that, but those polls were a bit more spotty than you might expect in a general election, and primary races can be a little bit harder to determine. Yeah. That primary field was certainly interesting, in large part because was it the last we've seen of Eric Greitens?
I feel like I should never say that, right? He keeps resurfacing. So maybe it might be his last run for office in Missouri, but I don't think it's the last we've heard of Greitens. He's very ambitious, and he does have supporters, but...
And he seemed to enjoy it.
He does, I think. And it's interesting. He was mired in scandal, had stepped down as governor, had personal scandal, and still was holding his own with Eric Schmitt for a long time. And it, they were both vying for that Trump endorsement, which came out as just endorsing Eric.
Left off the last name.
That's right. But it was a crowded field, too. There were plenty of strong candidates outside the Erics, so it was an interesting primary.
Vicky Hartzler was one of those who might have come in third in that race, could not clear in the top position there. There were Billy Long, a congressman, State Senate President Dave Schatz, just to name a few, who were running in that race. But with Eric Greitens, it really seemed to come down to that really bitter custody battle. That was the thing that I think became difficult for him to overcome, and obviously that's a tough personal fight for anyone to go through.
It is, and I think right in the weeks leading up to the primary election, the Schmitt campaign started running a lot of those, and others started running a lot of those ads, really extrapolating some of the stuff from that court case that was fairly damning, and I think that did its job. Eric Greitens was not successful.
That's our
And
number.
I think a lot in the Republican Party breathed a sigh of relief about that, by the way.
Yeah, and with the Senate Republicans remaining in the minority on Capitol Hill, there was some consternation over whether or not Josh Hawley and Eric Schmidt would get their way in ditching Mitch McConnell. They did not. He
Right.
retains his leadership position there as a Senate minority leader, but we'll see what the future of the Senate Republicans has in store for them. Moving on now to number 4, corruption at City Hall. This was a story that dominated much of the headlines in St. Louis politics this year and kept me and many of my colleagues busy at the federal courthouse, watching as there was first the indictment and then the not guilty plea, then the switch to guilty plea, then the sentencing of former Board of Aldermen President Lewis Reed, former Alderman Jeffrey Boyd, former Alderman John Collins Mohammed, that creating a power vacuum that Megan Green would ultimately step into and win her election. We'll get to her in a moment, but first there's just this dragged on the fall from grace for Lewis Reed,
Yeah.
Jeffrey Boyd, and John Collins Mohammed, really a stain on the city.
It was a stain on the city, and I think particularly Lewis Reed, because not just because of his position as president board of aldermen, but because he has been such an institution in St. Louis for so long. And so I think when the other two kind of fell, that was a big stain on St. Louis, but then Lewis Reed was sort of like that toppling of the whole house of cards, it felt like.
Certainly, and I asked you this question about Sam Page earlier, but some of the critics of Mayor Tashara Jones have raised the same question. Can you point to any legislative victories of hers? And again, if you set aside the big tranches of money from the Rams or from the federal government, what are her wins? This is not the way anybody would want to build a political dynasty, by watching the feds come in and basically take away all of your political opponents.
Right. Yeah, it again, it was a very odd time frame, and then with this coming in, it will be interesting to see now that with COVID dying down and with a favorable Board of Aldermen president who was endorsed by Tashara Jones, will she be able to accomplish more of her agenda in this next year?
Yeah, and
Of course, Megan Green will have to run again in a few months, but
we'll even see if she faces any opposition. We knew that Alderman Tom Oldenburg was considering a run. He's pulled those cards off the table. He's going to run again just for his ward as alderman there.
Right.
So we'll see if Megan Green faces opposition or not. Her defeat of Jack Coder, who was more the moderate centrist Democrat against the leftist progressive, who more of a democratic socialist Megan Green is than maybe a moderate traditional Democrat you might expect. I think the feeling in a lot of St. Louis city politics is that the political momentum is in her lane. And
I think that's fair.
if she's there, she has the backing of Cori Bush and Mayor Jones, who's going to beat her?
yep, I can't name anyone that I think will beat her at this time.
It will be interesting to watch to see if there are any moments of tension or conflict or even disagreement between that. And we should mention, with Megan Green becoming the Board of Aldermen president, the first female to hold that position, it is now a completely female-controlled city, the triumvirate, with Darlene Green as the comptroller. And we'd love to have her on this program, too. Maybe there's an idea for the new year.
Another historic first for St. Louis.
Certainly. And that Green coming to power, promising that progressive purge of corruption, was also a big part of her messaging strategy. She said she would be cleaner and more equitable, just the way she passes out government funds, to sort of rinse out any of those perceived or real conflicts of interest.
And I think one of her focuses in that was on the TIFs, tax abatements, development, because that's where a lot of these controversies came around. And so I think that's something that the city should take up, is reforming that process as well.
Should be interesting. We will watch that. Number 3, we're going to go back across the Mississippi River into Illinois now, something that might have faded from some of your memories, and it's a story that has been going on for some time, but officially in the early spring of this year in 2022, the feds dropped the hammer on the velvet hammer, indicting Mike Madigan, the most powerful politician in Illinois for decades and the longest-serving, longest-tenured House Speaker in American history, officially charged. He had been under investigation for some time, but it wasn't until 2022 that federal prosecutors finally brought criminal charges against Mike Madigan and his inner circle, his confidant Mike McLean, a former House Democrat turned lobbyist who had been in communication with ComEd lobbyists and a number of other political workers. Mike Madigan remains to this day fighting those charges. He slowly stepped away from power in early 2021, then facing the criminal charges, using much of his political nest egg. And the state Supreme Court, interestingly, in 2022 said it is legal to use your political piggy bank to pay your criminal defense fees.
Yeah, and he continued fundraising pretty prolifically even after his indictment. It's a huge shift in Illinois politics. And, you know, we saw then Illinois elect his first black Speaker of the House, and the same day he took office, this sweeping criminal justice bill passing. And so I think it will be interesting to see what maybe a new generation of Illinois politicians might prioritize that could be different.
Yeah, and that's certainly with a new state House leader, a speaker in Illinois, and a new Senate president there. It seems like the dawn of a new day in terms of that next generation.
Yeah.
We're going to see as we head into this next big election cycle in 2024 if either party really embraces and elevates those next generation of leaders or stays with the tried and true. I don't know if I can say true, the tried, the tried anyways.
Trying something.
Right, but we have some good news as we continue through our top 10. I think for the most part, that's the end of our corruption headlines.
Right.
Although there's
depending on how you contextualize.
Construe one of these. There's a hint or a teaser for you if you're still watching on the edge of your seat to see which two other political stories make the top 10 for us. But Mike Madigan ranking at number 3, and really just for his tenure and longevity there. Of course, all these corruption scandals are nothing that anyone should celebrate, but they do mark the history books as moments and chapters of power corrupting itself and staying in power for too long. Of course, one of the things we hope to do is shine lights of transparency on what people in power are doing to hopefully avoid and prevent moments like those so that next year in our top 10, they're not there.
Let's hope.
Let's hope. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Should we take any bets?
No.
That's probably too callous. Let's not. That's a little too cynical. We won't go that road. Number 2, a Titanic of a news story that raptured much of our attention, even making prime time across national news networks for much of this year, but Congress investigating and holding hearings to look back at January 6th. Yes, we know January 6th happened in 2021, the year before, but it wasn't until this year where Congress spent really 18 months, more than the entire calendar year, digging in, using its subpoena power, even sending Steve Bannon to jail when he refused to testify and appear before Congress, just to try and pry new information out, text messages, testimony, documents. We learned this year that the spouse of a Supreme Court justice was in close communication with some of these organizers around the violent attempt to block the will of the American people on that day of certifying the election. How will history remember what we learned about that attempt in this calendar year of 2022?
I think that the committee did a good job in sort of laying out their argument in a multimedia format that was digestible by the American people. Now, one could argue they had the benefit of really not having opposition on that committee, so there wasn't sort of this back and forth fighting.
The opposition could have been there.
They could have.
They had the opportunity to be there. They bowed out.
They could have, but I'm saying one might argue that they were able to lay out their case more seamlessly because there were not opposition. Now, there were Republicans on the committee, but not Republicans who opposed this investigation.
In a way, in Illinois' Rodney Davis was appointed by the House to be on there, but by the House Republicans to be on that panel, and could have seated himself, but it was after Nancy Pelosi said about Jim Jordan and Jim Banks, you guys were involved in voting to decertify the election. You guys were involved in stoking these flames. And in fact, they later tried to subpoena Jim Jordan and he didn't show up.
Right. Now they're referring him to the House Ethics Committee. When
she stepped in and said, you guys cannot be seated, that was an unprecedented act. You could say there was justification for it. Then the other Republicans, I think, adopted what you might call Kevin McCarthy's possum strategy, roll over and play dead. Don't put your people on the panel, don't justify it, so that you can later come back and say, oh, it wasn't truly bipartisan. But that was their choice.
Right, and there were Republicans on the committee, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. But I think the committee did a good job of laying those out. I mean, we were watching the president's daughter testify, the president's son-in-law, his attorney general, testify about what happened behind the scenes, his legal counsel. And I think it was striking. It was also striking to me to particularly see like Rusty Bowers from Arizona and other poll workers, people who are just performing their duty, and how the big lie, this misinformation, impacted their ability to do their jobs and live their lives. We saw in the midterm election the results that all of these new candidates running for governor in many cases who embraced those election lies, the lies over 2020, one after the other lost. Yeah. Over and over again. What role, if any, did this hearing play in sinking their electoral chances? I think that, some people would say, oh, they weren't effective at changing minds. But when you look at the exit polling, threats to democracy was one of the top issues that people were using to decide in their vote. And I think that the proof's in the pudding. The fact that those folks did not win, those, particularly the Trump-endorsed candidates who were really, like a Carrie Lake, really adhering to those lies, were unsuccessful. I think that says something about how this affected the American people.
We heard from Jack Danforth, former Missouri Senator and longtime conservative Republican Jack Danforth, who said he would express some concern about setting a precedent of a new incoming administration jailing or prosecuting the outgoing administration, but because he doesn't want that precedent, but that no one's above the law, and that in this case it might be the right thing to do. He was not eager to say that. He wasn't celebrating the idea of trampling Trump, so to speak. But he seemed to be heavy of heart when he said it might be the only way out of this.
I think many people were uncomfortable with the lock her up chance, the idea that we would jail one's political opponent. And I think many people are still uncomfortable with the idea of, prosecuting, possibly incarcerating a former president. But ultimately, we do have an obligation to uphold the law and to see that through. So these are the balances that the Department of Justice is trying to strike with their special prosecutor and letting them move forward with that.
We move on now to the top political story of 2022, something that upended half a century of political precedent in this country, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, when the Supreme Court struck down that landmark abortion protection and passed the Dobbs decision. It not only changed the law of the land as it was for nearly 50 years, but it also set off a string of political fights in state houses, in congressional districts, and in Senate races for governor across the country, and will likely affect the outcome of the 2024 presidential race too, as Congress still tries to see if it can gather the political will to write laws. State legislatures are scrambling to do that, and in Kansas, just one state to our west, we already saw the immediate aftershock. A red state there, but Democrats and independents cobbling together enough votes to not only decide the outcome of an abortion-related amendment question, their initiative petition, as it were, but also to decide the outcome of a governor's race in Kansas. There are just any number of angles you can take and look at: the direct impact in clinics to women, to reproductive rights, but also the conservative religious right who achieved this victory of theirs, this political victory they had been pursuing for 50 years. Right. How do you look back and just process all that was this chaotic change, this pivot away from what had been precedent for so long?
Well, as you said, conservatives, the religious right, have been pursuing this for 50 years. And so in the moment that the Dobbs decision was leaked and then officially decided, there was this eagerness we saw in Missouri, a race to enact trigger laws, and this feeling of victory among conservatives. But I think that kind of shifted fairly quickly as we saw Kansas as sort of the canary in the coal mine, and Kansas having a surge in registrations, a surge in voter turnout, and opposing a measure to outlaw abortion. And then there were, in all 6 states that had measures on the ballot this year regarding abortion, and all 6 went the way the abortion choice advocates would want them to. And so in none of those occasions did anti-choice initiatives win. So I think that was telling. And so I think that we've seen some conservative politicians dial back some of the rhetoric and maybe not try to place this issue at the forefront.
Putting direct questions on the ballot about abortion or about marijuana or any other, in Illinois, the Workers' Rights Amendment about labor, it can be something of a poll turnout. It's a treat, right? It invites a certain voter to the polls. In Missouri, we talked in number 10 about the marijuana ballot initiative, how you only need 50% to win something in Missouri. And it's actually not that hard to get the question on the ballot in Missouri in the first place.
Well, that you could say that, but this year there were 89 initiatives that were attempted. Of those, 2 got the needed number of signatures, and only 1 met all of the thresholds.
So it's a big hurdle to get it on the ballot, so to speak, just to get you got to show you have grassroots support everywhere.
That's right.
Across
And
the state.
you need funding. So you have to get the signatures in 6 of the 8 congressional districts. Now, the state, what you were maybe getting ready to talk about, is the state legislature last year tried to work on this, but they were kind of too busy on redistricting, but we'll bring it up again to make it more difficult to get ballot initiatives passed, particularly constitutional amendments.
Well, and the reason why we're discussing this ballot question is because it might be very obvious strategy for Missouri Democrats to put that question about abortion on the ballot, put it to the voters in Missouri in 2024. There's a lot of big races up. There's a governor's race up that year. Can they do that already Missouri State House Republicans are scrambling to find a way to make it harder to get that question on the ballot, or if you do, make it harder to pass it. It looks like there is sort of an effort already to blunt, if not defeat, that strategic attempt to turn out votes or to overturn the abortion restrictions in Missouri.
That's right. And we've already heard leaders in the state legislature say this is a top priority for them this session, is changing that initiative process.
All right, that's our top 10. You may have thoughts of your own. You can rank or come up with your own top 10 list. But Anita, before we go, do you have any other honorable mentions, any things that maybe we left off of this list?
Well, I just mentioned that probably what is, for me, one of the other big issues was redistricting. So in the Missouri State Legislature, that sucked up the entire last session, right? Mm-hmm. We saw infighting in the Republican Party, accusations of a Pelosi map, and ultimately another 6-2 congressional map. But another interesting thing is that the bipartisan commission that decided the State House map actually came to consensus, which, is a small miracle in itself. And so, and then we also saw in Illinois, the Democrats controlling the redistricting process there, with one seat being eliminated. So that was very adventurous as well. So I think redistricting was a big story.
And that had the effect of Rodney Davis, the Republican incumbent, losing his seat to Mary Miller, the more far-right conservative firebrand in that race there. One other honorable mention, I didn't make our top 10 because nothing truly changed. There was more smoke than fire. But a lot of heated discussion around safety, criminal justice, and the SAFETY Act, the end of cash bail, coming to Illinois in 2023. That was a law that passed in 2021, sort of skipped over much of 2022. That's why we didn't include it in our top 10. But we heard a lot of that on the campaign trail, and it didn't really play much of a role in the outcome because all the people who passed it also won their races.
That's right. And then they kind of quietly passed that measure to clean up some of it.
Yeah, there was that at the end of 2022. Thank you for joining us. We very much enjoyed bringing this program, launching this program, and sharing some of what we've learned about Illinois and Missouri politics with you, our viewers, on the record this year in 2022. And Anita, it's been great to have you with us.
I've enjoyed these discussions. Thank you.
We will see you in 2023. Until then, we're off the record.